Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Where do we come from? That question has launched the best stories, whether they are shared at a grandparent's knee or in our national folklore or our ancient myths. We human beings are fascinated with where we come from, for the stories of our origins can tell us a lot about ourselves. And while we often play fast and loose with the facts in these stories, they tell a very important truth about who we were, and more importantly, about who we are becoming. Telling stories is central to our lives in community. Storytelling is what holds any culture together. It centers our identities and reflects what we hold most dear. Our 21st century American culture tells stories all the time about who we are and what we value. And I'm not just talking about books. Every TV show, every commercial is a story. Every film, every song. They all have something to say about what the artist values and what the artist thinks we should value. They can also speak to what's happening in our collective culture right now. Media trends reveal a lot about us. For example, what's with all the competitive reality shows? What do they say we value in each other? Or how about our latest fixation on vampires and zombies? What do they say about our archetypal fears? Our ancient sacred stories also have much to tell us about our values and our fears, but they often tell a story that runs counter to what we might see in the media. This morning is a prime example of that. For us as Christians and for our Jewish brothers and sisters, the first chapter of the book of Genesis is the ultimate where did we come from story. Most often we just read a snippet of this text or just focus on the part that talks about us. But this morning we read the whole thing because this story is about so much more than us. It's a poem that sings to the constantly creating, constantly changing, constantly becoming relationship between God and all of creation. It's a story that attempts to make meaning out of our most profound fears and longings. It's a story that helps us experience the mind and heart of God in the world around us. And in this era, when the fate of creation seems so tenuous and uncertain and under siege, we need to hear this story. This creation story, this myth, arose during the time when the Israelites were being held in captivity in Babylon. Exiled from their homeland, they were surrounded by the myths and creation stories of a hostile and violent culture whose experiences of God were very different from their own. As UCC pastor Kate Huey notes, while their oppressors, the Babylonians saw the origins of the universe as a bloody battle between opposing forces with winners and losers, the Israelites told their children a rather different story, a story rooted not in violence, but in goodness and in blessing. They experienced creation as a process where light came from the deepest night and order arose from chaos. The sun and the moon and the stars were placed in the overarching sky as beacons and guides, signs of beauty and the changing seasons. God filled the earth with abundant, nourishing food and moved back the waters so that creatures could walk upon the earth and grow in diversity. It was into this world that we human beings were lovingly placed, the story says. Made from the earth, but inspired with the breath of God, we are made in God's image. And as such, we are entrusted to care for, we are responsible for the wonders that surround us. Now, as I said earlier, this story is a myth. It is not history, and it is not science, and it was never intended to be. Like all sacred and profound myths, it uses poetry and metaphors and symbols to share a truth that is larger than any that mere facts can contain. Now, unfortunately, our post-Enlightenment brains have discarded myths as meaningless fairy tales and have elevated facts to position of ultimate truth. but facts are simply the details of the where, when, and how questions. Myths tackle the why questions, and that is where the ultimate truth lies. When we forget this, we just end up talking past each other. Our current polarizing debate between religion and science is a prime example. There is no conflict between the theory of evolution and the poetry of Genesis. They both lift the veil on our origins. They both reveal an elegantly complex and constantly changing universe. They each claim a dramatic birth event. Science calls it the Big Bang, and Genesis calls it God's voice that got the whole thing started. You can believe in God, and you can believe in evolution. In fact, truthfully, I don't know how you can separate them. One is poetry, and one is science, but they both speak to the truth. In her book, The Luminous Web, Essays on Science and Religion, theologian Barbara Brown Taylor muses that even with the incredible discoveries that science has made, its language and its limits can't totally explain the fullness of where we all came from. There is so much yet to discover. But she wonders even more at our capacity to recognize God underneath it all. She reflects on the marvelous journey that has taken creation from a scattering of quantum particles to the evolution of a creature that can lift up its eyes to heaven and wonder where it all came from. And whether we measure that distance in 7 days or 15 billion years, it remains a miracle that we are here at all, able to praise our Maker. Taylor writes, God may well prefer the sound of chickadees, but I have to believe that there was divine joy when the first human being looked at the sky and said, thank you for all this. The fact that we are here to marvel about all this, no matter how you describe it, it is a miracle. And the fact that human communities have developed sacred stories to explain why we are here means that it matters to us to understand. So if we approach this sacred poem as our where do we come from story, what meaning does it have for us? What does it tell us about ourselves, about our world? I'm indebted to the reflections of essayist Debbie Thomas for some of the insights that I have gleaned on this. Well, the first thing that our creation myth tells us is that we come from a world that is good. Rather than a world of original sin, Genesis describes a world of original blessing. This story literally overflows with abundance, abundant life, abundant beauty, abundant food, abundant wonder, and it was all created as good, worthy, and right, how it was supposed to be. Despite later theologies that pit material against spiritual, Genesis affirms the goodness of our world. Despite our rush to create theological systems that judge and condemn, Genesis tells us that God created us inherently good. Let's just rest our judgy, anxious, striving minds in that for just a moment. We and everything in creation is good. The next thing the story tells us is that we come from a God who makes things new constantly. The poetry describes the origins of a creation that continues to create, a system of constant becoming, where new possibilities emerge at every moment. But the possibilities do not just run in one direction, from God to us. Creation has the power to respond as well, giving God ever more to build on. Genesis has set in motion a never-ending chorus of call and response between God and creation. In Genesis, we hear of the first early days of this process, but science has shown us that it never stopped. Neither God nor creation is stagnant. Through an ongoing creative partnership with God, we are in the constant process of becoming the next thing that we are called to be. God begins with one word, light, and the spark is lit. From that one command, the rest of the universe unfolds and unfolds and unfolds, each day offering greater and greater complexity, each new day possible by what was created before. Exchange the poetic metaphorical idea of days for the scientific concept of eras, and a conversation between Genesis and Darwin appears. Evolutionary scientists and theologians alike have noted that the order in which the Genesis poet sets each new day of creation roughly reflects the order in which the universe did come into being. There is an elegant process afoot in which a new thing is created from that which came before. Theologian Frederick Buechner puts it this way: using the same old materials of earth, air, fire, and water, every 24 hours God creates something new out of them. If you think you are seeing the same show over and over again 7 times a week, you're crazy. Every morning you wake up to something that in all of eternity never was before and never will be again. And the you that wakes up was never before the same and will never be the same again. We are part of the ever-renewing miracle of creation. The third thing the story tells us is that we come from night and day, from dark and light. Somehow, in its later years, largely due to an infatuation with Greek philosophy, traditional Christianity became rife with dualisms. We call the spirit good and the body bad. We began associating darkness with evil and light with divinity. But we don't get that from the Genesis story. There are distinctions between dark and light, yes, but there are no oppositions. This story tells us that dark and light work together, that spirit and matter are all part of God's creation. In our poem, creation begins not at dawn, but in the evening of each day. The dark of night, providing a wonderful womb for the new birth of the day to come. As Taylor says, human beings live by sunlight and moonlight, with anxiety and delight, admitting limits and transcending them, falling down and rising up. To want a life with only half these things is to want only half a life. The fourth thing the story tells us is that we come from the likeness of God. Now, we don't quite know what this means. Are we like God in our spiritual traits, our physical ones, in our creativity or our consciousness? We just don't know. But if nothing else, being made in the image and likeness of God is imprinted deep into our identity. Even on our worst day, we contain a reflection, maybe just a tiny echo, of God's intentions and dreams and promises for us. We belong in this universe. We belong on this earth. We are God's, and God is ours. Finally, the very last thing this story tells us is that we come from a God who rests, a God who knew when to say when. We have lost that art in our culture today. We pride ourselves on busyness and multitasking. We feel guilty when we sit idle or take a nap or spend an afternoon daydreaming instead of weeding the garden or drafting a budget. Remembering that we come from a God who rested is rather startling and humbling. How can we claim we don't need a break when God took one? Of all the wonders that God created in that first week, that last day, the Sabbath day, is the only thing that God calls holy. Everything else from soup to nuts is good and very good, but only taking a rest is holy. Let's think on that a bit, while napping or idling or daydreaming preferably. So, my friends, that's the story of where we come from. We come from goodness, from possibility, from shadow and light, from the image of God and from a reverence for rest. And we are at one with creation. We are responsible for its care. If we can embrace this story, imagine how that might change the way we approach the world. If we knew deep in our being that Earth's default setting, that our default setting is not evil, but radical world-changing good, could we just sit by while creation is abused or neglected or sold to the highest bidder? Would we destroy mountaintops for a few months of energy or muck up the water and the air so that corporations can have higher profit margins? And what would it feel like to look at each other and see the face of God reflected back? Would we be so quick to find fault or wage war or ignore or reject or neglect one another? Would we reject and abuse ourselves, mistreating our bodies, wasting our gifts, squandering our dreams if we knew that they came from the imagination of God? We tell these same stories for the same reasons that our ancestors have told them for thousands of years. It's powerful to know where you came from because it can change where you are going. Into a culture that seems to focus mainly on greed, corruption, exploitation, and violence, we need to remember that we come from a different story. Whether we prefer the poetry of Genesis or the vocabulary of science, this story tells us that we come from a beginning filled with good stuff. We come from the best of beginnings. We come from a marvelous creator who never tires of creating new things, who builds on each moment and on each new possibility, and who invites us to create right alongside her. Most importantly, we come from the loving heart of God, and we have been created to beat its rhythm into the future, so that in telling and retelling this story, the next generation can learn where they came from too. Amen.